Mark Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against the moving truck, letting out a satisfied sigh. The sun was beginning to dip below the suburban skyline, casting warm, orange hues over the quiet street. This was a fresh start. After years of saving, hustling through contracts, and grinding in a demanding career, he had finally bought his dream home. As Mark carried the last box inside, he felt a rare sense of peace. He knew he was an outlier here, a single, black professional in a predominantly white neighborhood, but he believed he could change minds through kindness and success. He figured the best way to dismantle people's prejudices was to just live, thrive, and let his work speak for itself. However, what Mark didn't realize was that Karen Wallace had already made up her mind. Karen sat stiffly on her porch, gripping a ceramic mug in both hands. Her knuckles were white. She could feel the rage bubbling up inside her, though she wasn't exactly sure who it was aimed at: Mark, her husband Steve, or herself. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Mark unload box after box from the truck. The man was efficient, calm, and worse, confident. He carried himself like he belonged here, like this house, and everything around it was naturally his. The audacity. Are you just going to sit there watching him all night? Steve's voice startled her from inside the house. Karen didn't answer right away. She stared at Mark's sleek black sedan parked in the driveway, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't fully articulate. I just find it strange, she muttered under her breath. Steve appeared at the screen door, drying his hands with a kitchen towel. What's strange about someone moving into their own house? Karen shot him a glare. You know what I mean? No, I don't, Steve said firmly. The guy bought the house fair and square. Let it go, Karen. But Karen couldn't. Seeing Mark stirred something deep inside her. A reminder of every dream she gave up. She was supposed to have a career like his once. Architecture was her passion. But then came the marriage, the house, the expectations of suburban life. The responsibilities piled on, and before she knew it, she was trapped. She never hated Steve, but over the years, she had started to resent the choices she made for him, for this life. And now, this man, this perfect, successful stranger, was moving in right across the street, flaunting the life she could have had. She felt an anger she couldn't suppress. Karen set her mug down hard on the porch rail, ignoring the faint crack that formed along the rim. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. What are you doing? Steve asked, stepping closer. Someone has to do something, Karen snapped, scrolling to the police department's non-emergency number. He could be anyone stealing from that house, squatting. How do we know it's really his? Steve threw up his hands. Jesus, Karen, you can't just call the cops because you feel uncomfortable. Karen ignored him and tapped the call button. Her heart raced as the phone rang. 911. What's your emergency? Karen took a deep breath, doing her best to sound concerned but composed. Hi, I'd like to report suspicious activity at 214 Maple Street. There's a man who doesn't look like he belongs there. He's acting strange, moving things around late in the evening. I'm not sure he's supposed to be there. Can you describe the individual? Karen paused, glancing across the street again. African-American, mid-30s, tall, fit. He's driving a black car. Might be stolen. Steve stormed out onto the porch, furious. What the hell is wrong with you? Karen turned away from him, cupping the phone against her ear. We'll send officers to check it out, the dispatcher said, and Karen felt a sick sense of satisfaction wash over her. Finally, someone was going to remind this man that people like him didn't get to just waltz in and make themselves at home. Mark had just finished organizing the boxes in his living room when the knock came at the door. It was sharp and deliberate. He froze for a moment. He knew that knock, the kind that carried authority. Slowly, he made his way to the door and opened it, coming face to face with two uniformed officers. The first officer, an older white man with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, cleared his throat. Good evening, sir. I'm Officer Harris. We received a report about some suspicious activity at this address. Mark raised an eyebrow, but kept his voice even. Suspicious? I'm just moving in. The second officer, a younger woman with sharp features and dark hair pulled into a tight bun, gave him a once-over. Are you the owner of this property? Yes, Mark answered, trying to keep his frustration at bay. He stepped aside and gestured toward the open boxes scattered across the living room. "Feel free to look around. I've got nothing to hide." Officer Harris exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Reed, who seemed to hesitate. She scanned the room, taking in the carefully labeled boxes, the utility bill on the kitchen counter with Mark's name on it, and the mail stacked neatly by the door. Meanwhile, Mark folded his arms across his chest, struggling to keep his emotions in check. He knew exactly what this was, another reminder that no matter how hard he worked, how respectable he appeared, someone would always see him as a threat. Officer Reed's eyes softened as she pieced things together. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you. We just needed to follow up on the call." Mark nodded tightly. "Right? I'm used to it." Outside, Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching intently. Her smug expression faltered slightly when Officer Reed and Harris didn't immediately handcuff Mark. Reed glanced out the window, catching sight of Karen. She clenched her jaw. "Stay here, Mr. Thompson. We'll be right back." The two officers walked across the street toward Karen, who straightened up, ready to explain herself. "Well?" she asked expectantly. Officer Reed's expression was cold. "We didn't find anything suspicious. The man lives there," Karen huffed, folding her arms. "I just thought—" "No," Reed interrupted sharply. "You didn't just think. You made a false report. That's a serious offense." Karen's face flushed. "I was only looking out for the neighborhood." Harris stepped in, his voice stern. "No, you weren't. You were harassing your neighbor. If this happens again, you'll be facing legal consequences." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time, the power she thought she held evaporated in front of her. Across the street, Mark watched from his window, expression unreadable. He let out a slow breath and smiled faintly. Victory, however small, tasted sweet. Mark sat on his couch, the soft hum of silence filling the air as the police cruiser rolled away down the street. He stared at the closed door for a moment longer, feeling a strange mix of anger and exhaustion wash over him. He was supposed to be unpacking, setting up his new life. Instead, he had just survived his first interaction with the local police, courtesy of a neighbor who barely knew him. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "Welcome home," he muttered under his breath. The next morning, Mark woke up determined to put the previous night behind him. He brewed coffee, turned on some jazz, and got to work unpacking. With every box he emptied, the house started to feel more like his. He mounted his architectural sketches on the walls, unrolled the custom rug he'd ordered from Morocco, and filled the kitchen cabinets with spices and ingredients he collected during his travels. But as the day wore on, a sinking feeling crept in, the realization that Karen Wallace was still out there, probably watching, waiting for him to slip up. Around noon, the doorbell rang, and Mark stiffened. For a brief second, he feared the police were back, responding to another false report. But when he opened the door, he found Steve, Karen's husband, standing awkwardly on the porch with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Hey," Steve began, shifting his weight. I just wanted to come by and apologize for what happened last night." Mark eyed him warily, but opened the door wider. "You're Karen's husband?" Steve nodded, offering one of the cups. "Yeah. Listen, I'm really sorry about all that. Karen can be intense." Mark crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. Calling the cops on someone moving into their own house is more than just intense. Steve winced. "I know. I told her not to, but..." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "She's been having a hard time lately?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "A hard time?" Steve ran a hand through his thinning hair. "It's complicated. She's frustrated. Feels like her life didn't turn out the way she wanted." He gave Mark a sheepish smile. "She wanted to be an architect, you know." Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. The irony wasn't lost on him. Steve continued, as if hoping to fill the silence with something that would make things better. "She gave it up when we got married. Kids, the house, you know how it goes. But seeing you, I think it just hit a nerve." Mark's jaw clenched. "So, she took out her frustrations by calling the police on me?" Steve had the decency to look ashamed. "Yeah, look, I'm not saying it's right. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not everyone in this neighborhood is like that." Mark let the words hang between them, weighing their sincerity. "You should tell her that," he finally said, stepping back into the house and closing the door with a curt nod. Meanwhile, Karen sat at her dining table, glaring out the window. Steve had told her he was going to smooth things over with Mark, which only made her feel more resentful. Why should she be the one to apologize? She wasn't wrong. She was just concerned. When Steve returned, she immediately knew from the look on his face that the conversation hadn't gone the way she hoped. "What did he say?" Karen asked, her voice sharp. "He's not happy, Karen," Steve replied bluntly, setting his empty coffee cup in the sink. "You made him feel unwelcome. Can you really blame him for that?" Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. "He's not exactly rolling out the welcome wagon either." "Karen, come on." Steve turned to her, his tone exasperated. "You called the cops on the guy. What do you expect?" She threw her hands up. "I expect him to understand why I was worried. It's not every day someone like him shows up here." Steve's expression hardened. "Someone like him? Do you even hear yourself?" Karen faltered for a moment, but the stubborn knot in her chest tightened. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." "No," Steve shot back, his voice rising. "You were trying to protect yourself." "From what?" "I don't even think you know." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, she knew Steve was right. Seeing Mark, with his success, his calm confidence, had stirred something ugly inside her. It wasn't fear, it was envy. Over the next few days, Mark tried to settle into a routine. He focused on work, reviewing blueprints and sketches for his upcoming project. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, Karen's presence lingered at the edge of his awareness. She was always there, watering her plants too often, rearranging her porch furniture, or standing in her driveway pretending to check the mail. Mark felt her gaze on him every time he stepped outside. She wasn't just watching. She was waiting for him to make a mistake, for an excuse to escalate things again. One afternoon, Mark decided he'd had enough. He threw on a hoodie and headed out for a run, determined to shake off the tension. As he jogged through the quiet streets, he noticed how perfectly manicured the lawns were, how the houses looked identical, how every car in the driveway was spotless. Everything here was curated, controlled. Just like Karen. When he rounded the corner toward his house, he saw her again, standing on her porch with her arms crossed, eyes locked on him like a hawk. He forced himself to keep moving, ignoring the knot of frustration in his chest. As he passed her house, Karen couldn't resist a parting shot. "Enjoying your run?" she called out, her tone laced with sarcasm. Mark slowed down just enough to give her a cool glance. "Trying to, without someone calling the cops on me." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but Mark didn't wait for a response. He jogged up his driveway and disappeared inside his house, slamming the door behind him. Inside, Mark leaned against the door, catching his breath. He knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't going to back off. Not easily. But he wasn't going anywhere either. He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, his mind racing with a mix of frustration and determination. If Karen thought she could intimidate him out of the neighborhood, she was in for a rude awakening. He'd dealt with worse than her before. And if this was the price of peace, so be it. Mark took a long sip of water, staring out the window at Karen's house across the street. "You picked the wrong guy to mess with," he muttered under his breath. Because Mark wasn't just here to live. He was here to stay. Days passed, but the tension between Mark and Karen only grew thicker. It was like an invisible force hovering over the neighborhood, quiet but impossible to ignore. Every time Mark left the house, to run errands, water his plants, or chat briefly with the mail carrier, Karen was there. If she wasn't directly staring, he could feel her watching from behind her blinds, waiting. Mark told himself he wouldn't let it get to him, but the truth was, it was getting to him. It was hard to relax when you felt like you were under constant surveillance. He could endure a lot, but this relentless scrutiny was beginning to wear him down. One evening, as he was sorting through a few last boxes, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Ryan, one of his closest friends. "Ryan, how's the new place? Settling in?" "Mark, settling in would be easier without my nosy neighbor watching me like a hawk." "Ryan, dude, it's only been a week. Don't let it get to you." "Mark, easier said than done." "Ryan, You need to hit the bar with us this weekend. Distract yourself. Mark, might take you up on that. Mark tossed the phone aside and exhaled slowly. Maybe Ryan was right. He just needed to get out, clear his head. But deep down, he knew Karen wasn't the type to lose interest. She wasn't going to stop until she got whatever satisfaction she was after. The following morning, Mark was reviewing blueprints at his kitchen table when the doorbell rang again. His stomach sank. He'd come to expect nothing good from unexpected knocks. But this time, it wasn't the police. It was Alice Reed, the young officer who had visited during the initial complaint. Mark opened the door slowly, giving her a suspicious look. "Officer Reed," he said, his voice flat. "Something I can help you with?" Alice gave him a small, apologetic smile. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" Mark crossed his arms. "Is this about Karen again?" Alice hesitated before answering. "Not exactly." Curious, Mark stepped aside and let her in. Alice walked into the living room and glanced around, clearly impressed by the setup. "Nice place," she said, awkwardly trying to break the tension. Mark wasn't in the mood for small talk. "What's this really about?" Alice sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "Look, I just wanted to apologize again for that night. I've been thinking about it a lot, and, well, it's been bothering me." Mark leaned against the wall, arms still folded. "Why's that?" Alice hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell the truth. "Because I know what that call was really about. It wasn't about suspicious activity. It was about—" She trailed off, struggling to find the right words. "Because I'm black," Mark finished for her, his voice calm but direct. Alice nodded slowly. "Yeah." The air between them grew heavy. Alice shifted uncomfortably under Mark's steady gaze, but she didn't look away. "I've seen it before," she admitted. "But this time I feel like I could have done more. I didn't push Karen hard enough that night. And She trailed off again, clearly frustrated with herself. Mark regarded her in silence for a moment. He appreciated her honesty, but it didn't change the fact that he'd been humiliated in his own home. Again, Alice cleared her throat, as if gathering her courage. "Look, off the record, if you ever need to document any further harassment, let me know. I'll make sure it's taken seriously." Mark gave her a long, considering look. "Thanks," he said, though his voice carried a cautious undertone. He knew better than to put too much faith in the system. Alice nodded and started toward the door, but before leaving, she paused. "For what it's worth, Karen's a miserable person. People like her can't stand to see someone else succeed. Just don't let her win." Mark let out a small, dry laugh. "Trust me, I have no intention of letting her win." Later that afternoon, Karen was in her yard again, pulling at imaginary weeds while sneaking glances at Mark's house. To her frustration, he wasn't home. His car was gone, and the curtains were drawn. A nagging insecurity gnawed at her. What if Mark wasn't bothered by her behavior? What if he wasn't paying attention to her at all? The thought of being ignored infuriated her even more. Steve's voice interrupted her from the porch. "Karen, give it a rest already." Karen didn't even look up. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Steve said firmly, stepping down into the yard. "This thing you're doing? It's not healthy. It's obsessive." Karen stood up, brushing dirt off her hands. "I'm just being cautious." "No, you're not." Steve crossed his arms. "You're punishing him." "For what?" "For having the life you gave up." Karen stiffened, anger flaring in her chest. "I'm not punishing anyone." Steve shook his head, exasperated. "You called the cops on him. You won't stop watching him. It's like, I don't know, you're hoping something will go wrong, just to justify what you did." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Steve wasn't finished. "He didn't do anything to you, Karen. You're the one who's making this a problem." Karen stared at him, stunned. For a moment, she couldn't think of a response. Was Steve really taking Mark's side? Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "You don't know what it's like to watch someone else live your dream. To feel like you made all the wrong choices." Steve blinked, taken aback by her sudden honesty. But Karen shook her head, brushing past him and heading toward the house. "Just forget it," she muttered, disappearing inside. That evening, Mark returned home from his run, his mind still buzzing with Alice's words. Don't let her win. Easier said than done, but it gave him a small spark of resolve. As he approached his front door, He noticed Karen standing on her porch again, arms folded, as if waiting for him. This time, though, Mark stopped. He turned slowly and locked eyes with her. "Is this how it's going to be, Karen?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "You going to stand there and watch me every day?" Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Mark shook his head and gave her a small, knowing smile. "You must have a lot of free time on your hands." Karen's cheeks flushed, but she stayed silent, gripping the porch railing like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Mark gave a small chuckle. "Well, get comfortable," he said, turning toward his door. "I'm not going anywhere." He slipped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality. And for the first time since he moved in, Mark felt something close to peace. Karen Wallace could stand out there all day if she wanted, but it wouldn't change a thing. The days continued to pass in uneasy silence. Karen's constant presence outside had become part of Mark's routine, an unpleasant but predictable pattern. Every time he left his house, she was there, hovering on her porch, watering plants that didn't need watering, rearranging her furniture over and over again. She never said anything to him, but her eyes spoke volumes. "You don't belong here." At first, Mark tried to laugh it off, telling himself that Karen would get bored eventually. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that she wasn't going to stop. It was becoming a game to her, one where she made the rules and controlled the board, daring him to push back. And every day, he resisted the urge to confront her. She saw it as a victory. Mark tried to stay calm, focusing on his work, but the weight of it all began to press down on him. The house, which had once felt like a refuge, was slowly turning into a prison. Even when he was alone, he felt like he was still being watched. One Friday evening, Mark invited a few friends over, hoping their company would lighten his mood. Ryan showed up first, a bottle of bourbon in hand, followed by two other friends, Jared and Nate. "Man, this place looks great," Ryan said, walking through the living room and glancing at the sketches pinned on the walls. "You've got good taste, Mark." Mark smiled, grateful for the compliment. "Thanks. Took me long enough to get it all set up." As the night went on, the group relaxed, talking and laughing over drinks. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt like himself again, like a regular guy, surrounded by people who understood him. But then the sound of Karen's porch door, creaking open, drifted through the open windows. Mark tensed. Of course. From the corner of his eye, he saw her shadow cross the lawn as she walked toward the driveway. She didn't say anything, but her presence was deliberate, a reminder that she was always there, watching. Ryan noticed the shift in Mark's expression and followed his gaze toward the window. "That her?" he asked quietly. Mark gave a short nod. "Yep, that's her." Jared frowned. "She still hasn't let up?" "Nope," Mark said flatly. "It's like it's her full-time job." Nate chuckled darkly. "Man, she sounds unhinged." Mark sighed, leaning back on the couch. "She's not crazy. She's just petty. It's not about me, not really." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "So what's it about?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "She used to want to be an architect." The room fell silent for a beat as the weight of Mark's words settled over them. Ryan let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's some next-level envy." "Yeah," Mark muttered. "And I'm the lucky guy who gets to remind her of everything she gave up." Jared shook his head in disbelief. "Some people really can't stand to see someone else doing well." Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So, what are you going to do? Just let her keep watching you? Let her win." Mark gave him a small, weary smile. "She doesn't win if I stay. And I'm not going anywhere." Later that night, after his friends had left, Mark stood at the window, looking out at Karen's house. The lights were off, and the street was quiet, but he knew she was still there, just waiting for another chance to catch him off guard. He felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He'd done everything right. He'd followed the rules, stayed calm, avoided confrontation. And still it wasn't enough. Why was that never enough? Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Don't let her win." Alice's words echoed in his mind. But what did winning even look like? If he stayed, Karen would keep finding ways to make his life difficult. And if he left, she'd feel vindicated. Either way, she won. The thought made Mark's stomach churn. He knew he couldn't keep living like this. waiting for the next insult, the next passive-aggressive gesture. Something had to give. The next morning, Mark was in his front yard, trimming the hedges, when Steve approached him cautiously. The man looked tired, as if the tension between Mark and Karen was wearing on him just as much. "Hey," Steve greeted awkwardly, shoving his hands into his pockets. Mark gave a short nod. "Morning." Steve shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I know this whole thing with Karen has been hard. For what it's worth, I'm really sorry." Mark paused, lowering the clippers. "It's not your fault." "Maybe not," Steve admitted, "but I feel like I could have done more to stop it. She's not herself these days." Mark gave him a skeptical look. "You mean she's not the person you thought she was?" Steve sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe. I don't know. She's been different for a long time. Angry, frustrated." "Yeah," Mark said flatly. "I noticed." Steve looked genuinely remorseful, but Mark wasn't sure if it made a difference. An apology didn't erase the damage. It didn't change the fact that Karen had called the police on him for no reason, that she had made him feel unsafe in his own home. "She's not going to stop, is she?" Mark asked quietly. Steve looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "No," he admitted. "Probably not." Mark nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. Karen wasn't going to change, and that left only one option. He had to take back control. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the sketchbook in front of him. An idea had been forming in his mind all day, and now it was starting to take shape. He grabbed a pencil and began to draw, the lines flowing effortlessly across the page. At first, it was just an outlet for his frustration, something to clear his mind. But as he worked, the design began to take on a life of its own. When he finally set the pencil down, he looked at the sketch and smiled. A new project. Something bold. Something unapologetic. Mark knew Karen would hate it, and that was exactly the point. The next morning, Mark stood in his driveway, surveying the pile of lumber and concrete bags that had just been delivered. The contractors would arrive soon, and in a few days, the empty patch of grass beside his house would be transformed into something magnificent, an outdoor studio and workspace. As he stood there, arms crossed, Karen stepped onto her porch, her expression tightening as she noticed the construction materials. "What's all this?" she demanded, unable to hide her irritation. Mark turned to her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's a studio," he said simply. "I need more space to work." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Work on what?" Mark's smile widened. "On things you gave up on?" The words hit Karen like a slap, and for a moment, she was speechless. Mark gave her a polite nod, then turned away, satisfied. This wasn't just about living here. It was about thriving here. And Karen Wallace would just have to live with it. The construction of Mark's outdoor studio became the talk of the neighborhood. Every morning, trucks rolled in, dropping off equipment, tiles, and lumber. Contractors hammered, sawed, and drilled from sunrise to sunset. Mark supervised everything with quiet satisfaction, sketchbook always in hand. The neighbors watched curiously, but none more obsessively than Karen Wallace. From her porch, she stood stiff and furious, arms folded across her chest, seething as Mark's studio took shape before her very eyes. The space was beautiful, clean modern lines, glass walls, and natural wood finishes. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a statement, and Karen knew exactly who it was meant for. When the final touches were complete, Mark invited a few friends over to celebrate. They gathered in the new studio, drinking wine and admiring the design. Mark's friends congratulated him on his vision, impressed by how quickly the project had come together. "You really pulled it off," Ryan said, clinking his glass with Mark's. "This place is incredible." "Thanks," Mark replied with a smile. "It's exactly what I needed." Through the glass walls, Mark could see Karen on her porch again, glaring at the scene unfolding across the street. She looked out of place, small and powerless, like a relic of another time, watching as the world moved on without her. Ryan noticed her too and nudged Mark with a grin. "Guess your neighbor doesn't like it." Mark shrugged. "Not my problem." And for the first time since he moved in, he meant it. That night, after the guests had gone, Mark stood alone in the studio, gazing out at the neighborhood. The cool evening air drifted in through the open windows, and the sound of distant crickets filled the silence. It felt different now, lighter somehow. Karen's presence no longer weighed on him the way it once had. She was still there, yes, but her power over him was gone. She had no control over his life. Mark leaned against the glass wall, thinking back to everything that had happened since he moved in. The police visit, the constant surveillance, the passive-aggressive stares. It had been exhausting, but he'd made it through. And in the end, he hadn't just survived. He had thrived. Across the street, Karen sat alone in the dark, nursing a glass of wine. Steve had gone to bed hours ago, tired of the endless arguments and resentments that had become part of their lives. She stared at the glowing studio, watching Mark move confidently through the space, unbothered and unapologetic. She felt hollow inside. All her efforts to push him out, to make him feel unwelcome, had failed. And now, all she had left was the bitter realization that none of it had worked. It wasn't just Mark who had won. It was the life she'd once wanted, but had let slip through her fingers. The talent, the ambition, the drive to create something beautiful. She had abandoned all of it. And now, it was standing right in front of her, across the street, embodied by the one person she couldn't intimidate. Karen lifted her glass and took a slow sip, knowing deep down that this was how it would be from now on. Mark wasn't leaving. And worse, he was thriving in a way she never would. The next morning, Mark went about his usual routine, watering his plants and tidying up the new studio. The air was cool and crisp, a perfect autumn day. For the first time in weeks, he felt at ease. As he walked to the curb to grab the morning newspaper, he noticed Karen standing in her driveway, watching him. She wasn't holding her phone this time. No fake smile, no crossed arms, just a tired, defeated look in her eyes. Mark glanced at her briefly, then turned back toward his house without a word. "Hey," Karen called out suddenly, her voice soft and hesitant. Mark stopped, but didn't turn around. Karen hesitated, as if the words she was about to say were stuck in her throat. Finally, she managed, "It's a nice studio." Mark stood there for a moment, processing her words. Then, without looking back, he gave a small nod. "Thanks." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was just an acknowledgement, simple, small, and final. And with that, Mark walked back to his house, the studio behind him, the future ahead. Karen watched him go, standing alone on the driveway as the weight of her envy finally lifted. She had lost, but for the first time, she felt a strange sense of relief because now there was nothing more to fight against. Mark had won, and there was nothing she could do about it. Inside his house, Mark closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. The war was over, not with fireworks or dramatic confrontations, but with quiet, stubborn endurance. And for Mark, that was the sweetest victory of all. He glanced around his house, feeling the warmth of the place settle over him. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home, his home, and no one, not Karen, not anyone, was ever going to take that away from him.